Bergson's Lectures on Psychology. Lesson 11. Instinct. Instinctive actions are rare in humans. Few are observed, albeit in small numbers, in early childhood and before the awakening of intelligence. Others occur in extraordinary situations, such as in the face of imminent danger. However, instinct is a normal mode of activity, mainly in animals, and it is especially in animals that it has been studied by psychologists and naturalists. An instinctive act is one that exhibits this internal coordination of elements, this characteristic finality, seen in human acts of reflection, is, however, performed without reflection. It is not unconscious. The bird building its nest is well aware of the movements it makes and which movements it is to execute. It probably even has an image of the nest it will build. It is less likely that the bird represents the use of its nest, the goal of it pursues. Therefore, consciousness accompanies the action, but only the action, while reflective activity represents outcomes or results beyond the action itself, to which this action is a means or a cause. The horizon of consciousness in intuitive activity seems limited to the knowledge of the movements currently being performed. We should also note that consciousness doesn't always accompany these movements. Sometimes it's only present at the beginning, sometimes only at the end of the executed act. What then is the mechanism of instinct? Generally, the external stimulus furnishes the occasion. Most instincts are season-dependent and rely on the general conditions in which the animal finds itself. It is possible that these stimuli cause sensations in the animal. These sensations are the starting point of instinctive actions. An instinctive act is indeed composed of a series of interconnected movements. The sensation experienced by the animal usually triggers the first movement, and the others follow, coordinated with the first. While in a voluntary act, each elementary movement depends on the image of the entire action first formed in the mind. In an instinctive act, consciousness seems to only form an image of each elementary movement as it's performed. The starting point of the series being not the idea of the whole, but one of its elements. In summary, the mechanism of instinct is the same as that of habit, and both instinctive and habitual actions, when viewed in themselves and not in their origins, are acts of identical nature, internally organized in the same way. However, instinct is innate, while habit is acquired. Let's briefly list the characteristics of instinct. Instinct is specialized. It pertains to actions of an absolutely determinate nature, and the animal would be incapable of showing the skill it demonstrates in that particular direction in any other way. Thus, it's mistaken for certain philosophers, and notably some contemporary English psychologists, to equate instinct with inclination. Inclination is just a tendency. It's instinct. In instinct, there is indeed a tendency, no doubt, but there is also a clear indication and even possession of specific means to achieve an end, which is the most interesting aspect of instinct. Instinct is intermittent in most cases. It manifests only in certain special circumstances, especially when the interest of the individual or the species is at stake. Instinct is automatic, if by automatic action we mean one that is carried out in full, even if it hasn't been fully willed or even fully conceived. We've compared it to habit. Cuvier likened it to a somnambulistic state. The animal performs a series of movements it's aware of, but likely doesn't understand the significance of. It acts on an impulse. A subject responding to a hypnotic suggestion probably feels something similar. This helps us imagine how some instincts, intelligent in themselves, are accompanied by so little intelligence in animals. If a bee's cell is pierced, the bee continues to pour honey into it and lay its eggs. Everything happens as in those somnambulistic states where the subject seems to not perceive or conceive of things that are not directly relevant to the acts and even the very movement they perform. Instinct is generally species specific, meaning it's common to all members of a given species. However, this rule has exceptions highlighted by the studies of Darwin and the origin of species. Generally, instinct is also immutable and perfect. It's precisely because it's immediately perfect that it doesn't feel the need to change. But here again, there are exceptions, and Darwin showed how the instinct of bees, for example, is far from being as perfected in all bee species. Instinct unquestionably changes, and often the instinct gropes as if it were seeking improvements. Such are the apparent characteristics of instinct. Viewed from a purely psychological point of view, instinct, as we said, closely resembles habit. It was therefore natural to seek to identify these two forms of activity, and since habit is the most understandable form, as it seems, since habit originates in intelligence and will, it is from habit that the principle was to be derived. This is the thesis supported by Condillac, then Lamarck, and finally Spencer. In the form given to it by Condillac, the thesis is untenable. Condillac saw in instinct a habit acquired by the individual and from which consciousness gradually withdrew. The most basic, immediate experience refutes this hypothesis. We see the animal perform instinctive acts, often very complex, immediately after its birth. However, Lamarck presented this conception of instinct in a much more scientific form by adding heredity to habit. Instinct would be inherited habit, a hereditary habit. It must be understood that Lamarck linked this theory of instinct to a very general conception of the evolution of organized beings. According to him, species derived from each other through transformation. This transformation occurs under the influence of an inner drive. The animal tends to adapt to its living conditions. Through an effort created by need, it shapes its body to some extent. Usage creates the organ, as Lamarck said. Thus, when placed in a new condition, the animal modifies its organism, and since this organism is hereditarily transmitted, the instinct related to the use of the organ is transmitted with them. This concept of transformism has been abandoned. Lamarck greatly exaggerated the power of effort and that of habit, but the idea of seeing instinct as a hereditary habit was taken up by Spencer. For Spencer, life is a continuous adaptation of internal relations to external relations. In other words, the living being strives and seeks to balance itself with its environment, changing in parallel with external changes. When this adaptation is complete, consciousness becomes unnecessary, which is why it fades. When it is incomplete, when the living being oscillates around its equilibrium conditions, Its steps and movements are accompanied by consciousness, and consciousness translates, makes note of the oscillation. It is always, therefore, a sign of imperfect adaptation. Let's assume that the individual initially poorly adapts to surrounding conditions, gradually adapts. Once the adaptation is achieved, he will have acquired what we call a habit. But we can assume that this adaptation was not achieved by the individual, but by his ancestors, and that heredity transmitted it. It will then manifest as a habit, with the only difference being that instead of being acquired by the individual, it was acquired by the species. It is innate. Instinct would therefore be a hereditary habit. Against Spencer's theory, Darwin raised a factual objection, an objection that seems decisive. This objection is drawn from the instincts specific to ants and especially bees, especially to neuter insects. We see in bee societies neuter insects showing remarkable instincts very different from those of fertile insects. Thus, it is not from their ancestors that neuter insects get their instincts, and on the other hand, they also do not transmit their instincts to descendants. The Darwinian explanation of instinct, however, also calls upon heredity, but this is no longer about a hereditary habit, and heredity operates in a much more complicated way. It is known that, according to Darwin, every species has a tendency to multiply beyond all limits. On the other hand, the amount of food and even the space that nature can provide is limited. Therefore, a large number of living beings must disappear. Which ones does nature eliminate? They are the ones least endowed with some accidental advantage. Thus, from the fact that there is only room for a limited number of living beings under certain conditions, it follows that a necessary struggle ensues, a struggle from species to species, especially a struggle between representatives of the same species. This struggle is not always and usually not a fight in the strict sense. Living beings struggle in the sense that some necessarily survive and others are necessarily eliminated, unable to withstand the competition to find their food alongside better endowed beings, unable to make a place for themselves in the light. It's less a fight for existence than an effort for existence. Struggle. It follows that a natural selection takes place among living beings, a selection comparable to that which the horticulturalist, the farmer, the breeder practice, but which differs from this in that it does not require the intervention of any intelligent force. By the free play of natural forces, the fittest survive, the least fit disappear. Accidental advantages, that is, due to chance, are generally transmitted hereditarily. In cases where they are not transmitted, the elimination of living beings that have not inherited them ensues. Thus, from generation to generation, advantageous differences accumulate. Let's apply this theory to instinct. Every instinct consists in the regular performance of certain useful acts to the individual and the species. These acts are far from being always performed in the same way, always with the same perfection. Darwin has provided numerous examples of instinctive variability. He showed how bee cells, for example, which we admire for their wonderful artistry, are far from being built by all bee species with the same regularity. Honeybees sometimes shape separate cells with very irregularly rounded. A Melipona domestica, Mexican bee, builds an almost regular wax comb composed of cylindrical cells. Finally, the bee in our centuries make hexagonal cells arranged in such a way that with a minimal amount of wax it achieves the maximum available space. Therefore, it wasn't immediately that the bee solved this trigonometric problem. Consequently, it can be considered plausible that the insect arrived at this result through a series of trials. It is not necessary for any of these trials to have been intentional or intelligent. But when, by chance, an improvement occurred, this improvement ensured the hive's habits a superiority over other insects of the same kind, leading to the eventual elimination of others. Hence, we can consider instinct as representing a large number of accidental benefits transmitted by heredity and consolidated by natural selection. Instinct is an approach that is natural to the species today, but was accidental at the beginning. There was no real contracted habits. There was an accumulation of partial or nascent habits, advantageous steps. This doctrine raises significant challenges while it has illuminated the variability, perfectibility, many instincts. It doesn't explain these very complicated instincts that necessarily had to be perfected from the start, or they would have been useless. Such are the instincts of certain hymenopterans, studied by French etymologist Mr. Fabre. Second, one might wonder if heredity accumulates accidental advantages as regularly as Darwinian claims. Finally, and above all, this struggle for existence that Darwin talks about, and which implies above all, as the English term struggle indicates, an effort. Would this struggle be possible if there were not already in every organized being an instinct, namely the instinct to fight, the desire to persevere in being, Spinoza, the will to live, Schopenhauer? This general instinct is therefore at the origin of every particular instinct, and it is this particular instinct that cannot be explained by selection or vital competition. In summary, it doesn't seem that instinct can be reduced to other modes of conscious activity. Should we therefore give up on any explanation? The difficulty of the problem mainly comes from seeing instinct as an extraordinary disposition of the living being, something added to life rather than an integral part of life. We assume an organized being and act as if this organism was self-sufficient. Since we observe this organized body performing intelligent acts accompanied by consciousness, but in which individual reflection plays no part, we imagine the force called instinct to explain these actions. This instinct resembles others, seemingly more comprehensible modes of activity, efforts are made to relate instinct either to habit or to intelligence. However, instinct is not something added to life. Instinct is an integral part of life. From its inception and in its humblest form, life is already instinct. When a protozoan moves appropriately to capture its food, it acts out of instinct. When a cell in a multicellular organism feeds, grows, divides, and cooperates with all the organism's cells, it exhibits instinct. The digestive tube only processing food and the organism seeming to make choices are actions of instinct. In mammals, we see milk secretions occur precisely when the offspring are about to be born. Doesn't this reflect a system of movements similar to those excited by an insect or bird preparing food for emerging larvae or chicks? One might say that instinct is life itself, but life unfolding under specific conditions where a certain consciousness is required because the individual has some freedom in choosing execution details while the overall plan is given. Darwin did psychology a great service by providing instincts variability. We believe that because instinct is variable, flexible, it is conscious. The process of life, vital phenomenon in general, are unconscious because consciousness is unnecessary for them, as they are regulated in detail as well as in their entirety. But when the environment demands adaptation or choices between details, consciousness becomes necessary, which is why it accompanies instinctive actions, always ready to intervene, yet usually not acting and letting it happen. Instinct is thus life itself, accompanied by consciousness at the moment when consciousness becomes useful. We shouldn't connect instinct to the higher activities of the self. Instinct is not reflective intelligence, unlearning reflection. It should be linked to the principle of life, whatever it might be, to the principle creating and preserving the organism. Consciousness only attaches to it as an accident.